So I'll review that procedure one more time. I'm gonna delete the cube, and before I recreate this animation, I'm just gonna pop open Word where I've drafted in really simple terms the recipe for animation in Cinema 4D. Okay, and I will post this inside Blackboard, but it's really simple. So if you want to jot this down in your notes, you can also refer to it. I'll post it here in just a moment. But the concept is that step one is you position the playhead. Step two is you position the object where you want it for that point in time that the playhead is positioned. So you position the playhead, you position the object, and you record the keyframe. And then you repeat. So I'll start over again by changing the playhead, changing the position of the object, and recording the keyframe. So let's try that out. So I'm going to introduce an object. According to my recipe, I need to position my keyframe first, or excuse me, I need to position my playhead first. So I'll make sure that that's at the beginning of time. Now I need to position the object, and I want that object to correspond with where I want this object to be at the beginning of time. And maybe I want the object to be closer to the foreground, but up higher in the air, up higher along the y-axis. And so I'll just position that accordingly. I'll just move that up, and I'll record the keyframe. And now I can start that recipe over. I gotta reposition the keyframe, and in this case I'll just go all the way to the end of time. I'll reposition my object, move it down just a little bit, and further back into the foreground, and now I'll record that position. The minute I do that, you can start to see that we actually have an animation path occur in Cinema 4D. Now this is a 2-point animation. If I scrub the playhead or I play my animation in time, I can see that I have a keyframe at the end of time, and that'll actually, that's an option inside the Cinema 4D viewport. I can see that that is a keyframe indicator. That's where my animation starts. This is where my animation ends. Okay, and what I can do is I can actually reposition that keyframe by clicking and dragging, and what it'll do is it'll update the trajectory of my animation. It'll update really where this animation starts and how it plays out. So I can tweak any of the keyframes that I see along my animation path. Now, in addition to that, I can also add keyframes, multiple keyframes, anywhere in time that I want here. So let's say I want this this cube to act more kind of like it's going up and down a roller coaster hill. So what I could do is I could advance my playhead somewhere in the middle of time. So if I'm dealing with 90 frames of information, about halfway is going to be 45. And what I can do is I'll position the playhead, I'll reposition the object, okay? And now the minute that I mark this keyframe, pay attention to what happens to this animation path. I'll mark the keyframe. Now that animation path has a third keyframe in it. And by default, Cinema 4D likes to curve out or smooth out any animation path that's been introduced into the equation. So as I scrub the playhead back and forth, and by the way, scrubbing the playhead is simply a term that means to grab, select and click the playhead and drag it back and forth. And what that can do is allow you to really approximate and test and see what your animation is doing. So let me just recompose the screen here, and I'll click and drag my playhead or scrub my playhead to see what that animation is that's happening. So essentially what I have in time is I've recorded the keyframe, I've recorded the position of this object at this point in time. I've advanced the playhead, I've changed the position and recorded that. And so each of these keyframes correspond with a coordinate change or a position change inside for this object inside this 3D space. Now, there are some other things that we can do as well. Because my playhead is over top of an existing keyframe, what I could do is I could grab the rotation tool and I could rotate this object, and I'll just rotate it. And I'm not too concerned with the exact coordinates that I rotated it to, and I'll hit record keyframe. Because my playhead is over top of this keyframe, I'm not going to get a new keyframe. What it's going to do is it's going to update that existing keyframe. And so now it recorded not just a change in position along the X, Y, and Z, but it also remembered a change in rotation. So this object has a coordinate and it has a rotation value to start with. And what we've done is we've changed the rotation value and the position value in time. And so the result is that we get this cube not only moving through space, but also rotating, and then it'll return back to its original rotation. So experiment with this process, just play around with it. You're not going to break anything. Worst case scenario, if I do something and Cinema 4D gets crazy, all I have to do is select the cube object, hit delete, and now I can recreate the cube. And just remember, if you inadvertently click on something, you want to reset your windows, you can just click on this icon here and choose the standard workspace, and everything else will reset. So let me just review that one last time, and I'll do it really quickly. I'm going to introduce a cube. I'm going to go back to the move tool. I'll make sure that my playhead is positioned at the right point in time that I want to record this position keyframe. So I've moved the playhead, I've moved the object, I'll record the keyframe. Now I'll advance the playhead all the way to the end of time. If I know that I want a keyframe somewhere in the middle, I could introduce that now, and we'll talk about different concepts and different strategies for introducing animation and how they should unfold. But maybe I'll just reposition the cube, first the playhead, then the cube, and mark that keyframe. I'll advance the playhead, I'll change the position of the cube, and I'll record the keyframe. And I essentially have a very similar animation to the one that I got started with. At this point, I could introduce some rotations, but just note that I have 3 keyframes in this equation, and I can tell because of these little indicators at the bottom of frame 0, frame 45, and frame 90. Now, one other important thing, the way that Cinema 4D handles animation is animation at this level is object dependent. And what I mean by that is that if I introduce another piece of geometry, something like a sphere, you can see that my animation path goes away. And if I look at my timeline, all of my keyframes went away, and that's because we have the sphere selected. Now, if I go back to the cube, once I select the cube, I see the cube path, and I see the cube keyframes here in time. So I have an opportunity to animate each object independent of the other one and see what those parameters are in time. So if I go to the sphere and I select that, I'll position the playhead at the beginning of time, I'll mark the first keyframe, I'll advance the playhead, I'll just kind of move that sphere up, I'll record that position change, advance the playhead once again. I need to scroll out a little bit so that I can pull that sphere back down. I'll just randomly kind of change the position somewhere, and I'll mark that keyframe. And this is the animation path that I'm left with. So if I scrub that playhead, what I'm looking at right now is the animation keyframes for the sphere because that's what's selected, and I'm also looking at the animation path for the sphere because that's the thing that's selected. Remember, I can go back in and I can click and drag and move the position of this keyframe in time and get some pretty interesting results. There's not a whole lot of control moving this around in the perspective view, but we can be a little bit more precise about that when we start building a more intentional animation. So that's the basic concept for getting geometry to move inside Cinema 4D. In the next presentation, we'll stage, we'll create some real simple moving geometry. We'll stage some things, we'll introduce some lights and a floor, and we'll talk about outputting a render. So we'll catch up in the next presentation.